Does Romans 14 say that we don't have to keep the Sabbath? A friend of mine this week told me that one of his relatives told him that Romans 14 says that we don't have to keep the Sabbath, or shows that we don't have to keep the Sabbath. So let's go into what Romans 14 says. Does esteeming one day, regarding a day, observing a day, or observing times, is that referring to keeping the Sabbath? Is observing times commanded in the Old Testament, or is it condemned in the Old Testament? So let's look into what Romans 14 says. And keep in mind this important point. If more than one scripture says something conclusive and is clear, if you have multiple clear scriptures on a topic saying one thing, and someone is telling you that a scripture that's not clear and that is open to a wide array of interpretations is saying the opposite, then what they're saying is probably incorrect. You should use the clear scriptures to form a doctrine, which I'll go over some clear scriptures later. But let's look at what Romans 14 says. In verse 1, him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. Verse 2, for one believeth that he may eat all things, another who was weak eateth herbs. Now, looking at that, it's not talking about God commanding that you have to eat vegetables only or you can't eat meat. This is what one person believes. Verse 3, let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. Verse 4, who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth. Yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. Here's verse 5. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. Now there it says nothing about the Sabbath. The word esteemeth in the King James comes from the Greek word krino or krino. It's Strong's 2919. And if you look at a Greek dictionary like one over here, or you can go online and see what the meaning of 2919 is. Some of the definitions are to pick out, select, choose, to prefer, to esteem. So the translation there, it looks correct. It's a correct translation. It's talking about one man esteemeth one day above another. If it was referring to the Sabbath, the word used, translated Sabbath in the New Testament is Sabbaton. It's Strong's 4521. It's used every place, I believe, that Sabbath appears in the New Testament, except for one place that's referring to the day before the Sabbath. So basically, when you see Sabbath in the New Testament, in all but one places it comes from Sabbaton, which is Strong's 4521. And Strong's 4520, which is a derivation of that, is Sabbatismos, which means to keep the Sabbath. We'll be discussing that later when I go over some clear scriptures. So there's nothing here about the Sabbath that's not mentioned. It's talking about one person esteems one day above another person doesn't. Let's see what verse 6 says. He that regardeth, now under regardeth, my note here says, or observeth, so keep that in mind. We're talking about regarding or observing days. He that regardeth the day, regardeth it unto the Lord. And he that regardeth not the day to the Lord, he doth not regard it. He that eateth, eateth to the Lord, for he giveth God thanks. And he that eateth not to the Lord, he eateth not, and giveth God thanks. So it's referring there to people that choose to only eat herbs versus others that will eat meat. And it's saying here, one man esteemeth or deems or chooses. Nothing to do with the Sabbath. God doesn't let you choose that. He commanded one day. When he wants something done, he'll tell you. He doesn't say on stuff like that, but make up your mind, choose your own day. He said the seventh day is the Sabbath. But there's nothing there about the Sabbath. It's referring to esteeming one day. Now, to get more clarity on this, it says here in my note here, it refers to Galatians 4:10. So here we've talked about regarding a day, esteeming a day, observing a day. Let's see what Galatians 4 says. Well, here, let's start with Galatians 4:3. Let's see. We want to get a sense, is it referring to God's holy days, or is it referring to people's personal preferences, or maybe pagan days that were observed by Gentiles when they were in the world? Look at Galatians 4, verse 3. Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. Now, elements or rudiments of the world is not referring to God's holy laws and commandments. If you go down to before we get to the verse I want to in Galatians 4:8. Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods. Now think about that. When ye knew not God, would imply they were Gentiles. Ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods. They would either be pagan gods or demons, whatever. It's not referring to the God of Israel or his commandments. Keep that in mind. That's Galatians 4, verse 8. Let's read it again. Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods. But now, after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? Now here's verse 10. Pay attention. This is similar to what we just read in Romans. Ye observe days and months and times and years. So now if you look at the context, it's not referring, as I said, to Israelite holy days. It's referring, it seems to be, to stuff, as it says in verse 8, when you didn't know God, you did service unto not the true God, but pagan gods. And verse 9 is referring to the weak and beggarly elements. It's not referring, God never refers to his law or commandments as that. It's the law is holy and the commandment holy, just, and good. Now, as I said, Galatians 4:10, ye observe days and months and times and years. The word observe there in verse 10 is paratereo. I hope that's pronunciation's right. It's Strong's 3906. And if you look at what that's referring to, nothing mentioned about the Sabbath. 3906 is referring to watch assiduously, observe carefully, attend to watch. So the King James translation is correct. It's referring to observing days. You observe days and months and times and years. Now, people that would claim these verses say you don't have to keep the Sabbath, by extension would mean that they'd have to be claiming that observing times is referring to the Ten Commandments and that God wants us to observe times. Well, does he? This is a pretty easy one to refute. Let's go to Leviticus 19, verse 26, and let's see what God says about observing times. Leviticus 19:26. Now, here's an interesting note from the Companion Bible, Bullinger's Companion Bible. He writes under observe times, i.e., watch clouds or days for good or ill luck, e.g., not commencing a journey on a Friday. So that's what he interprets observing times. It's personal preferences, superstition, it sounds like. So if you go to Leviticus 19:26, the verse says this, ye shall not eat anything with the blood, neither shall ye use enchantment, nor observe times. So it says, Leviticus 19:26, neither shall ye use enchantment nor observe times. So observing times regarding days cannot be referring to the Sabbath because it's condemned here in the Hebrew Bible. Now, some more verses that condemn observing times, Deuteronomy 18:14. See what that says. For these nations which thou shalt possess hearkened unto observers of times and unto diviners. But as for thee, the Lord thy God hath not suffered thee so to do. So we're not supposed to be observing times. So people that claim that observing times regarding days, esteeming days, is referring to something God commanded in the Old Testament that was done away is kind of illogical. Observing times regarding days was not commanded in the Old Testament. If anything, it's spoken ill of. Other verses that refer to that, 2 Kings 21:6. Let's go to that quickly. This is referring to Manasseh, the evil king of Judah, which I believe followed good Hezekiah. Verse 6 of 2 Kings 21. And he made his son pass through the fire and observed times and used enchantments and dealt with familiar spirits and wizards. So it seems that all this stuff about observing times regarding days has its genesis, its origins in paganism and pagan worship. It's frowned upon in the Old Testament, and it's frowned upon in the New Testament, so it can't be referring to God's Sabbath. It's one more verse about observing times in 2 Chronicles 33, I believe it is. Where's that? Excuse me one second. 2 Chronicles 33:6. This is referring again to Manasseh. And he caused his children to pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Also he observed times and used enchantments. So we see observing times is not referring to the Sabbath. It can't be referring to the Sabbath. It makes no sense. And as I said, those are kind of confusing scriptures that aren't quite clear. If you look at Romans 14:5, Galatians 4, when it's referring to regarding days or observing times, those aren't clear scriptures at a glance. You have to dig into them and see, like we did, to see that it's referring to superstition. Maybe I don't want to do a journey on Friday, as Bullinger said, or you don't want to do this on a Tuesday, kind of like a superstition, like not wanting to be on the 13th floor of a building. It's not referring to the Sabbath. Now let's look at some clear verses to see what God says about the Sabbath. Now you got to keep in mind too, to look at, and I've said this before, to look at whether we have to keep the Sabbath, it kind of defeats the purpose. The purpose is to show what sin is. 1 John 3:4, sin is a transgression of the law. Psalm 119, 105 says, thy word is a lamp for my feet and a light to my path. Or in King James, thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. It's to show you what sin is. If you go to Romans 3, verse 20, this is what the purpose is. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in the sight. That's true. But people misinterpret that to say you don't have to keep the law. It's like when they read Colossians 2, verse 14, and I did a video on YouTube. You could look that up if you want an in-depth analysis of that. Colossians 2, verse 14, when it says blotting out the handwriting of ordinances, it should be blotting out the certificate of debt. In other words, you've broken the law. It produces an IOU showing your debt to have broken the law. So what Jesus did on the cross, his blood wipes out the penalty of your law breaking. It's like getting a pardon from the governor. It doesn't mean the law is done away. It says your guilt is wiped out, your certificate of debt. And if you study Colossians 2, verse 14, all the new good translations are translating a certificate of debt. The word is chirographon in the Greek, and you could look it up or watch my video on that. So when you see something like that, or any verses that say you can't, you're not justified by works, of course you're not. It doesn't mean you don't have to do works. So when you read this in Romans 3, verse 20, therefore by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. The law is not there to earn us our salvation, but it's there to show us what sin is. Now, should we sin? Romans 6, verse 1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? That's Romans 6, verses 1 through 2. So, we looked at those scriptures about observing times and preferring one day over another, esteeming one day over another. It's not referring to the Sabbath. People that tell you otherwise are using unclear scriptures to force a doctrine that is in contradiction to clear scriptures. Now, other clear scriptures, to blow through these pretty quickly, that would imply that we should be keeping the law, or that it wasn't done away. Like I said, to say you have to do it. Whether you have to keep the Sabbath, you can look at that the same way, whether you have to keep the adultery command or the command against idols. If anything, as I'll show later, the Sabbath command was re-commanded in the New Testament. Matthew 5, verse 17, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. And then verse 19 shows, whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. Then if you read it, it's actually making the commandments more binding in a sense of not just the letter, but in the spirit. It's not just you don't commit adultery, it's you shouldn't lust. It's not just you don't murder, you shouldn't hate. So that's one verse that would go against the idea that we don't have to keep any of the commandments anymore. And of course, a lot of these people, they just want to get rid of the one command. That's their motive. You talk about fake news, and there is a lot of fake news. There's a lot of fake religion news, such as that the verse in Romans 14 shows that we don't have to keep the Sabbath. That's fake religion news, as well as those that claim that Colossians 2, verse 14 says the Ten Commandments are done away. That's absurd, but as I've said before, people could say that because, one, most people aren't going to look into it, and most people just follow their parents' religion. You should love and honor your parents, but you shouldn't blindly follow their religion, because our parents are just following, in large measure, their parents' religion. So most people today who have access to better information, the internet, all kinds of knowledge, let relatives that lived 300-400 years ago determine their fate for them. That doesn't make any sense, and God doesn't respect that. You're supposed to search out your own salvation, be diligent to find your own salvation. You're supposed to find it for yourself. You're not supposed to say, well, I grew up in this religion, I'm just going to follow that. No, you should work out your own salvation, I think is the verse. But at any rate, a couple other verses in Matthew to wind this down. Matthew 12, well, all right, starting at verse 9. Verse 8 says, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. It's another point that would support my side, but let's skip that for now. Matthew 12, verses 9 through 12. And when he was departed thence, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days, that they might accuse him? Now, if the Sabbath was going to be done away, and you're Jesus, what would you say? You would say, we don't have to keep that day anymore. Esteem whatever day you like. That's legalism. He didn't say that. And if it was going to be done away, don't you think he would have known? He was the Word made flesh. I think he would have known that. Okay, now, so verse 10, getting back to that. And behold, there was a man which had his hand withered, and they asked him, Jesus, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days, that they might accuse him? And he said unto them, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Listen to this, verse 12. Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. So 2 points. This discourse would have made no sense if the Sabbath was going to be made not obligatory anymore, or, like I said, I don't like the word obligatory, if it was going to be done away, to use how the Sunday keepers, like Protestants like to say, done away, or some of them do anyway. If you were going to do away with that and not the other 9, you wouldn't say that. But and the fact that Jesus said it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days, it was important to him to show that it was lawful to do well. So, by extension, what is lawful on the Sabbath days is important. Otherwise, you wouldn't say that, right? 2 other quick verses in Matthew. Matthew 19, 16 through 19. That's where Jesus was asked. And behold, one came and said unto him in Matthew 19, 16, good master, what good things shall I do that I may have eternal life? And he said unto him, why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. Now let me interject something else here. Now Jesus was not saying he wasn't God. He was saying, why are you calling me God, good? There's only one good, that is God. He didn't say he wasn't God. In the same way, I think when, remember near the end of one of the Gospels, when Jesus said, referring to John, if I will, I don't know the exact quote, if it's my will that he tarries till I come, what's that to you? He didn't say he will tarry till I come again. He said if it's my will. Similar here. He didn't say that he wasn't God. He says, basically saying, why are you calling me good? There's only one that's good, that's God. So just a little point I want to interject there for the people that like to claim Jesus isn't God. He's not saying he wasn't. Okay, and he said unto him, why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. But if you will enter into life, keep the commandments. And then the next 2 verses, he named some of them. Now, he didn't name the Sabbath one, but he named the ones that deal with how you treat others, your neighbor. He also didn't name the one about idols and having no other gods before God. But he was referring to the 10 Commandments. Finally, in Matthew 24, if you read the chapter, it's referring to the second coming. Verse 3 says, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world or age? Now, this is Matthew 24, verse 20. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And if you go down a few verses to verse 27, for as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So it's referring to the second coming, and in referring to that, he said, pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Again, is that a direct Sabbath command? No, but it makes no sense if Jesus believers, followers are not keeping the Sabbath. One final point, I'd mentioned before that in all but one places in the New Testament, the word for Sabbath is Strong's 45:21, Sabbaton. Now, except for one verse that's referring to the day before the Sabbath. Now, a derivative of that is Strong's 45:20, Sabbatismos. That's the Greek word that means to keep the Sabbath. Look it up, Strong's 45:20. Now, let's look at Hebrews 4. This is seems like a direct Sabbath command. And aside, why would Jesus have spent so much time talking about what's lawful on the Sabbath? As I said earlier, I don't think he spent that much time talking about the other commands. Did he know that people would try to claim that you didn't have to keep it in the future? Had he read in Daniel where it talked about those that seek to change times and laws? Just saying. All right, to Hebrews 4. Now, if you look at Hebrews 4, the word translated rest in all verses of Hebrews 4, except verse 9, is kataposis, which means a down sitting, means to rest. Kataposis, that's the word translated rest, except for verse 9. All right, in verse 9 it says, there remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. Now my King James margin says, or a keeping of the Sabbath. That's what it means. The word is sabbatismos. Look it up. It's Strong's 4520. It means to keep the Sabbath. So that verse really should say, there remaineth therefore a keeping of the Sabbath for the people of God. To the people of God. It never should have been changed. It shouldn't have been rest, because if you read that casually, you'll think it's the same word translated rest the rest of the chapter. And most people, that goes with their bias. Now let me show you this Bible in closing. This is Lamb's translation of the Aramaic. This is how he translates that verse. Hebrews 4 verse 9. Some people think that the New Testament was originally written in Aramaic. I tend to think it was Greek, like most people do, but at any rate, this is how he translates. I don't know if you could see it, if you can get it on there. If not, I could try to tweet it out. But he translates Hebrews 4, verse 9. Well, go to verse 8. For if Joshua the son of Nun had given them rest, he would not afterward have spoken of another day. Verse 9. It is therefore the duty of the people of God to keep the Sabbath. So when you've got clear verses, as I've gone through in Matthew, a clear verse in Hebrews 4, verse 9, for people to say that obscure verses that talk about esteeming a day, regarding a day, one person regards it, one doesn't, one person says, and it's on a par with saying one person says you have to eat only vegetables, another one says you can't eat meat. That's all personal choices. Or if you look at Old Testament verses, it could be referring to pagan, or even as Ephesians was implying, said when you knew not God, you followed those that were not gods. Some of those regarding or esteeming that people falsely claim is referring to the Sabbath could be referring to pagan practices, worships of pagan gods, or even devils. So now I've gone over Romans 14, verse 1 through 6. And if you want a more in-depth explanation of Colossians 2 and how that's been misinterpreted, I have a YouTube video on that. I hope this was helpful. If it was, share it. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.